In theology, there's a good practice that you start with what Jesus has said, and then you spin out from there. So start with Jesus' words, then you move to the teaching of the apostles in the New Testament, and may look back into the Old Testament and see how these fill out what Jesus has said. Then you move from Jesus to the rest of the church to what was the early church practice, and then on forward from there. And that's basically the methodology that we're going to take today as we look at the topic of opportunities for the church in times of social upheaval. So let's start with a couple of teachings from Jesus himself this afternoon. From Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, it's interesting. Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount is talking to followers from Galilee who tended to be Jewish. When Jesus says, if anyone sue you and take your tunic, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. My suspicion is here that Jesus is primarily talking, or if he's not talking about his hearers, would primarily be hearing Romans. Who is it that in Jewish society of that time could force you to give up your possessions unwillingly? Who could force you to go someplace that you didn't want to go? The Roman government. They had the military occupation. They could make you do things you didn't want to do. So when Jesus is saying, if someone tries to take your cloak, give him your, if someone tries to take your tunic, give him your cloak as well, but it forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. I suspect that Jesus, at least partly in his mind, is talking about if a Roman soldier tells you to go 1 mile, go 2. And he's saying this to primarily Jewish listeners. We see this distinction between Gentiles and Jews again in our next reading from Matthew chapter 20. Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever will be great among you must be your servant, and whoever will be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. And of course, we look at that last part, to give his life as a ransom for the many. And we know this is exactly what Jesus did as he was crucified by Roman soldiers. So Jesus not only taught that we should serve rather than be served, but he lived that out to its fullest extreme, even to his crucifixion by Roman soldiers. Our next inquiry into the words of Jesus takes us to his parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, I think you know the parable. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to point a couple things out. Jesus tells this parable about a Jew and a Samaritan, who, by the way, is the hero in the story. The Samaritan. Why is this shocking? What do you know about the relationship between Jews and Samaritans in Jesus' time?
The Samaritans were Jewish people who had fallen away from the faith, or Jewish descent.
So historically they had been Jewish up until about the time of the fall of Jerusalem, about 586 BC. They had fallen into mixed marriages with people around, idolatry according to the Jews.
The Jews hated the Samaritans.
The Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans probably didn't think real highly of the Jews either, but the Jews hated the Samaritans. Who's Jesus talking to in this parable, by the way?
Jews.
Jews. Who's the hero of the story?
A Samaritan.
A Samaritan. Okay. Very important context there. Two very different people are shown to be in relationship with the one who is hated by his hearers, coming out as really the one to model after, the one who gives of himself. And look at these last couple of lines here. As he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, he talks about the priest, the Levite, and then the Samaritan. You know, the priest and the Levite pass by and ignore the injured man. The Samaritan stops to help. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the key word here is neighbor. We'll come back to that at the end. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed you mercy. And Jesus said to him, read this together now, you go and do likewise. Right? So you recognize who your neighbors are and go and serve as the Good Samaritan served and as Jesus ultimately served and laid down his life for us all in crucifixion. Well, now we move out from Jesus' words into the lives and teachings of the apostles, in this case specifically St. Paul. This reading is from Acts chapter 11. A little background here in the text. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. This is very early in Saul's ministry, just after his Damascus Road conversion, one of his first works for the church. And when Barnabas had found Saul, also known as Paul, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year, they met with the church and taught a great many people. And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. So that just kind of sets the stage, where we are in the history of the church, where we are in Paul's ministry. Now, in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. There's a distinction in this passage, again, between the believers in Jerusalem, who are primarily what ethnic group? Jews. And what specifically do we see here that they're talking with people who are Gentiles in Antioch? Very small Jewish population in Antioch. They're primarily talking to Gentiles. This is almost as strong a distinction as Samaritan and Jew in Bible times. In the Old Testament, there were two types of people. There were God's people, and there were the Goyim. The Goyim was everybody else. That's what we translate usually as Gentile. And so you have the Jews, who were God's chosen people, the one that God favored, the one that God worked on behalf of mightily, and then you have the Goyim. You have everybody else. Didn't make the cut as God's people. This was kind of, I'm not saying this is right, this is kind of the mentality that we see through the Old Testament. And so, what's happening in this passage? The Gentiles, the Goyim, are saying, our brothers and sisters in Christ in Jerusalem, who happen to be Jewish, are hurting. And we are going to help them. And so the Gentiles, who had largely been looked down upon, despised by the Jews, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly for centuries, say, we are going to help our brothers and sisters in Jerusalem in their time of need. This happens again in the ministry of St. Paul. Now Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, also primarily a Gentile church. And St. Paul says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come home. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredited by letter and carry your gift to Jerusalem. Different time, most likely, same scenario. The Jewish church in Jerusalem was hurting and in need. And St. Paul was determined that the Gentile churches should gather offerings as they could, to each one according to what they've been given, and send it to the Jewish church in Jerusalem. So again, you have people from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, saying, we are now one in Christ, and we are going to support and encourage even those that used to look down on us, even those that used to didn't associate with us. We are going to support them in every way we can. Well, let's move on from the time of the New Testament into the time of the early church. And the early church was based in what culture overall? Do you remember who was the big power on the block in the time of the early church? Rome, yeah. Rome, probably one of the most violent, wicked regimes ever, excluding possibly the modern United States, and we're getting there awfully fast. But there was a different view of why you do good things in the Roman Empire versus in Christianity. We're going to look at this for just a minute. The difference is called the difference between liberalitas and caritas. The Roman view of doing something good was called liberalitas. Basically, it was a kind of a, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. So if I am a very wealthy Roman citizen, and you are a very poor Roman citizen, I might give a large amount of money to do something that will benefit you. But this gift comes with strings attached. You then are to perhaps perpetually pray to the gods on behalf of me and my family. Or perhaps you are to support me in the next time that there is a kind of a reshuffling of political power in Rome. And so Roman citizens, wealthy Roman citizens could be generous. They certainly would endow different public projects and so on, but they always expected that those that they were working on behalf of would do something in return. This is called liberalitas. Kind of sounds like political parties today, doesn't it? We pass a law, we do something that we think benefits you, and then what? You're supposed to vote for that party or the other, right? Okay? So liberalitas, kind of think how political parties work in the United States. That's kind of how Rome worked. The rich and the powerful would do some good things for those in need, but then they would expect those in need to turn around and do something to benefit them as well, whatever that might be, whatever they could. The Christian church comes along with a very, very different view called caritas. Caritas is sometimes translated as love. And love does not do something with the expectation that it's going to be returned. Love says, I am going to give myself for you. Whether you do or can do anything in response whatsoever. This was potentially a concept unheard of in Roman society. To say that I am going to share and pass along the blessings that I have without any expectation that you were going to do something in response for me. To do something completely without the expectation of payback. Caritas was a very, very different mentality from what you saw in the Roman Empire. And that developed in the church through the teaching of Jesus Christ. The Son of Man comes not to serve, but to be served. Let me say that again. The Son of Man comes not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. And we see that in the early church as Paul would collect offerings for those in need without any expectation of anything in return. So the early church puts this into practice. This is supposedly a drawing of St. Dionysius of Alexandria. He was a church leader in Alexandria in the first half of the 200s AD. And if you know much about Roman history, you know this was not a terribly healthy place. Episodes of the plague swept through Rome on a pretty regular basis, or through Roman colonies, which Alexandria was included. And pagan Romans had no hope, really, for a life that's better following this one. And so basically their philosophy was, I'm going to try to get all that I can out of this life here and now. And so if a Roman pagan had a family member who was stricken with the plague, this is kind of foreign to our minds, maybe a little bit less foreign now in COVID, unfortunately. But the Roman pagan would see that, maybe mom is suffering from the plague. They would take mom and dump mom at the side of the road, and they would flee to the hills. They would not provide any care for their loved ones, their nearest family members that had the plague, because they know that they could then be stricken with the plague and that they would die, and they had no hope beyond that. And so, what the early Christians would do is they would go around and see, oh, here's Mom lying in the ditch suffering from plague. Mom's relatives have fled. Christians would actually pick Mom up and carry her back and care for her. And by the way, sometimes contract the plague themselves, but they did not fear the plague because they knew that a greater, better life awaited them in the resurrection. And so here are a couple of things that St. Dionysius of Alexandria wrote about Christian care, health care in times of plague. The pagans thrust aside everyone who began to be sick and kept aloof even from their dearest friends, and cast the sufferers out upon the public roads half dead, and left them unburied, and treated them with utter contempt when they died. Now here's the contrast to the church. Very many of our brethren, while in their exceeding love and brotherly kindness, did not spare themselves, but kept by each other and visited the sick, without thought of their own peril, and ministered to them assiduously, and treated them for their healing in Christ, died from time to time most joyfully, drawing upon themselves their neighbors' diseases, and willingly taking over to their own persons the burden of the sufferings of those around them. Did this have an effect in Roman society? Absolutely, it did. Remember St. Dionysius of Alexandria was about the first half of the 200s. Christianity was an illegal religion in Rome at that point. That changed about 60 to 70 years after St. Dionysius of Alexandria died. Under Emperor Constantine, about 320, 325 in that time frame, the Emperor Constantine decreed religion to be a tolerated religion that should not be persecuted anymore, and then went on over the years to declare that Christianity was not only tolerated, but should be the official religion of Rome. Why did that happen? My suspicion is it happened because Christians sacrificially loved and served their Roman neighbors in need. And so Roman citizens, once they had received this love and care from the Christian community, recognized how beautiful this truth of Christianity was and wanted to be part of it. Well, a couple of emperors after Constantine had made Christianity the official religion, one of his successors, Julian the Apostate, decided he wanted to go back to Roman paganism. He wanted to bring all of the Roman Empire back into Roman paganism. And he saw a problem. He said, the impious Galileans, that's his word for Christians, relieve both their own poor and ours. It is shameful that ours, our pagan brothers and sisters, should be so destitute of our pagan assistance. Do you see the problem that Julian the Apostate faced in trying to re-paganize Rome? The Christians had loved the Roman Empire into Christianity, and paganism couldn't match it. He recognizes if he wanted to re-paganize the Roman Empire, he would have to outserve the church. And he eventually realized he couldn't do it. His last words as he died in battle, not by the way fighting Christians, he says, "You Christians, you Galileans have conquered." This is not a military conquest. This is a conquest of love and service. And he recognized that Christians loved and served in a way that his Roman pagans didn't. And that is how, in my way of thinking, Christianity won over the Roman Empire. Well, let's fast forward another couple hundred years to this guy, Pope Gregory the Great. Ruled as Pope from about 590 to his death in 604. I've just started doing some research and reading on Pope Gregory. I'm really fascinated by this guy. We're going to just spend a little bit of time talking about Pope Gregory the Great. If you ever have some spare time and want to do some reading, read up on Pope Gregory the Great. He's a fascinating guy. He was born to a very wealthy, powerful Roman family. Early in his career, he was a member of the Roman Senate, and in fact, the ruler of the Roman Senate. He was one of the most influential, powerful political figures in all of Rome. After his parents died, he left that life of Roman wealth and power. He actually sold off his family's properties and estates in order to found monasteries. And he himself entered a monastery that he founded in his parents' estate in Rome. Now, interestingly, it seems that he entered the monastery as a plain ordinary monk. The one who leads a monastery is called the abbot. That's like the boss of the monastery is the abbot. History seems to indicate that in the monastery that he himself founded with his parents' estate, Gregory goes in not as the abbot. He goes in as a simple, everyday monk. And he spends his time in study, in contemplation, in prayer. Then he's called out of that lifestyle against his will. He doesn't want to leave the monastery. But the Pope before him calls him out of his life in the monastery and says, I need you to go to Constantinople and be my ambassador to the empire, to the emperor. Now there's something a little strange here. Gregory's in Rome, and he's sent to Constantinople in a different country to the emperor of the Roman Empire. Something strange there? This is kind of like saying, I want you to be the ambassador to the President of the United States. You go to Montreal, Canada. Do you see the difference there? Well, here's what happened. The city of Rome had become so unlivable that a couple hundred years before the emperor said, we want nothing to do with the city of Rome. We're still going to be the Roman Empire, but we're going to rule the Roman Empire from Constantinople. Because Rome was a mess. It was a sewer. It was horrible. And the emperors wanted nothing to do with it. So the Pope in Rome sent Gregory to be his ambassador to the Roman Empire, emperor, not in Rome, but in Constantinople. Eventually the Pope died, and Gregory then is elected as Pope. That's what he's doing. He actually writes a letter to the emperor saying, don't confirm me as Pope. Say you want somebody else to be Pope. People intercepted that letter, never got to the emperor. The emperor did confirm Gregory, and he became Pope. But let's see what happens after he's made Pope in 590 AD. Remember I said that he'd gone into a monastery. And Gregory really, really appreciated the quiet life of study and prayer and contemplation in the monastery. He missed that as Pope, because now he was heavily involved in the administration of the church, the business aspect of the church, the political aspects going on in Rome. And he couldn't spend his time in prayer and meditation as much. This is a really interesting quote from Pope Gregory the Great. As he says that he, and by application we too still today, need to find a balance between growing our own faith life through contemplation and putting that into practice. Gregory says, we must note that just as the right order of life is intent from the active to the contemplative, so the soul often reverts profitably from the contemplative to the active, so the contemplative life, having kindled the mind, the active life might be the more perfectly led. For the active life should convey us to the contemplative, and sometimes the contemplative life should send us back to the active life, when the mind turn in on itself beholds. So basically, Gregory wanted to study and meditate and pray. He had to do administration. He found he couldn't do one without the other. The contemplation fed action. Action then led back to contemplation, and it's this cycle we need to keep in mind as well. Moving on with Gregory. So when he was elected Pope, here are some of the challenges he faced. Military sieges. Rome was under attack regularly. There were blockades to keep food from coming into the city. A vast amount of destruction, depopulation. During its height, say a couple hundred years, 300 years before Pope Gregory, Rome probably had a population of about 1 million people. About 100 years, within 100 years before Gregory, an invading army came through and wiped the population down to literally zero. Not a single inhabitant in Rome. Think about the city of St. Louis, completely vacated. Not a single living soul in St. Louis. That's what happened in Rome. By the time of Gregory, the city had regrown to about maybe 100,000, about a tenth of where it had been a couple centuries before. Vast destruction, famine, plague. Gregory's predecessor actually died of the plague. The previous pope died of the plague. These are the problems going on when Gregory becomes pope. So what does he do? Gregory the Great was determined to use the resources of the church to benefit the poor and the needy. The church had vast wealth already at that point, but Gregory was determined not to live a life of wealth, but to use that wealth on behalf of the poor. Gregory realized that all resources are given to us by God, and therefore, quote from Gregory, we must not keep them to ourselves as private use in proportion to the degree that we realize they're given to us by our Maker for the common good. So Gregory used the resources of the church for the good of Rome. John the Deacon, who was an earlier biographer of Gregory writes, "To all the poor, he," that is Gregory, "distributed the accumulated revenues at the beginning of every month, at the appropriate times, grain, wine, cheese, vegetables, lard, edible animals, fish, or oil. He distributed most carefully as the head of the Lord's household, so the universal church appeared, in fact, as a universal larder." What's a larder?
A larder is a cellar where you keep all your goods.
Right, we might say as the cupboard, as the pantry, all right? So Gregory turned the church into the pantry for all of Rome. And he used those resources for the good of the population. So here's our question. What are the needs the church should currently be trying to meet and supply? What do you see? You recognize those pictures? What is that?
Burning buildings.
Do you know where and when? About a month and a half ago in Minneapolis. Now I got to tell you, I grew up there in Minnesota. I did, yeah. And yeah, some of my family members up there still talk like this. They do. This kind of hits home to me. I didn't grow up in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, but I grew up in Minnesota. And so to see this coming out of my home state, it really hits home. So, do you see rioting, looting, devastation, or do you see a community in desperate need of the church? Here's some headlines from about that time. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the major newspaper in Minneapolis, St. Paul, writes, "Minneapolis neighborhoods face food desert after looting close multiple stores." The situation is so bad, it's called a desert, a food desert. Marketplace writes, "Neighborhoods where stores were destroyed become food deserts overnight." Here's a part of this news story about a gentleman named Sylvester Hudson. He had to walk 40 minutes to buy groceries. He doesn't have a car. Public transportation was shut down. The nearest grocery store was a 40-minute walk. And so he had to walk, pulling a cart to get his groceries. By the way, he's 70 years old. The closest place he can get food is a 40-minute walk away. Also from the news story, in many neighborhoods that have seen looting and vandalism over the past week, residents are now with few, if any, grocery stores, pharmacies, and other essential businesses, which is made even harder by the fact that lots of stores also closed because of the pandemic. There's a 6-mile-long commercial corridor in South Minneapolis called Lake Street. It has been destroyed. We no longer have pharmacies in our communities, said Zoe Ann Martinez, who works for the Lake Street Council, a business association. We no longer have gas stations as well. Our largest grocery stores are also gone, Martinez said. Right now, our community, we live in a food desert, which happened overnight. Do you see rioting and looting, or do you see a hurting neighborhood in need of the church? Here's a very interesting quote. "I've never seen the shelves this empty," she said. "If people can't get to their grocery store, they should check with churches. They should check with churches or support groups offering free food and groceries." Isn't that exactly the right answer? If you're in trouble, if you're in need, you should check with churches. And the article specifically mentioned one, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, Minneapolis, Minnesota. I went to their website. Today is Wednesday, July 15th. It is 1:45. Guess what? Right now, at this very minute, they are receiving donations. And as of noon today, they opened up in a different area that the donations have been processed to give out those donations to the community. Here's from their website all the things that they're receiving as donations to hand out. There's the schedule for where you drop them off. This is the free food pantry they've opened to the community in the last month and a half. That is what the church has done in times of social upheaval. That is what the church still should do. Similar situation happened right here in St. Louis, probably 15, 20 miles from here in Ferguson a few years ago, right? Michael Brown was shot by a police officer. There was large-scale looting, rioting. One of the epicenters of the rioting was Quick Trip in Ferguson. Here is the fire at the Quick Trip and then the after effects. Well, I want to show you what happened a couple years later. the Quick Trip was torn down, and that very spot, the center of the looting and rioting, was turned into a community center that included, by the way, an outreach of the church. It was called Lutheran Hope Ministries of St. Louis. And so right in the middle of the rioting, where the rioting had been the worst, the church went in to bring help and hope. Here's a flyer I found on their website about a job fair that they hosted for a hospital that was hiring in the area to try to bring jobs back into the community, bring stability back into the community. The church brought hope where there had been desolation and hopelessness before. This is Pastor Micah Glenn. He was the pastor that was placed in this devastated area in Ferguson. He'd grown up in Ferguson and went back. These are pictures. This is Pastor Glenn looking very official at dedication day. This is him on the job doing his ministry for real, working among the people of Ferguson to bring hope. This is Pascal. You might know him more as an apologist from his wager, but here's a really insightful thing that Pascal says about the way the church gains recognition by serving in culture. He says, "Men despise religion. They hate it and fear to find it true. To cure this, I must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason, it's venerable. Inspire respect for it, next render it attractive, and make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is true." That's backwards what we usually do. We try to argue someone into Christianity first and then show love. What Pascal says, we just need to do the opposite. We need to love and serve. Show that Christianity is good and loving. And then when people ask questions, you can say, "Oh, and by the way, it's true." Okay? That, I think, is the pattern we see in Jesus and the pattern we see in the early church. So, I want to encourage you as the church. The church needs to, again, be more involved in human care and health care. These are two areas we've highlighted throughout the talk. St. Dionysius of Alexandria showed the church was heavily involved in health care in the early church, in the days of the early church. Gregory the Great showed it was heavily involved in human care. I didn't tell her I was going to do this, but my daughter Abigail is with me here. She's going into 6th, 7th grade. And she is talking that she wants to be a medical missionary when she grows up, wants to go into nursing and go into the mission field to bring medical care along with the gospel to people who would not have either one. I want to encourage you. Is there a way that you can use your career interests to serve those who need to hear the gospel, but also who simply need the care that you can give? This slide is about a project that's in the center here called Lansdowne Community Initiative in East St. Louis. I serve a parish about 20 miles from East St. Louis, and my congregation is partnering with a congregation in East St. Louis that has started a nonprofit organization to start to rehab properties around the church. The Lansdowne Community Initiative is now trying to buy up abandoned properties around the church, rehab the houses, and rent or sell them to members of the community so there will be some pride and some ownership within the community. Here is a couple of my sons working with a member of the East St. Louis community doing some brush cleanup. Here's the pastor of the church that we're partnering with doing some cleanup work. Here's a crew mixed together for cleanup day. There's some guy hauling brush up there. These are two of my sons and a friend they met at a cleanup day. And I put this before you, not to kind of pat my congregation family on the back, but to give you an idea. Find ways that your congregations are doing this. And if they're not doing it, find ways to get your congregations to do this. What can you as the church do as the early church has done in this regard? I mentioned my sons. Two of my sons, Jonathan and Matthew, our oldest two sons, have come to base camp the last several years. I think Jonathan for 3-4 years and Matthew, I think, for 2 or 3 years. They're not here this week. And there's a reason. I had registered them like back in December. And they're not here. And it's not because of the change from Lindenwood to here. It's not because of the residential versus non-residential. It's not because of anything at base camp. The reason is they were asked to serve as counselors at a camp called Camp David of the Ozarks down by Rolla, a couple hours south of here. Camp David of the Ozarks ministers specifically to students, youth, whose parents are incarcerated. Normally, these students would not have the opportunity to have an upbuilding, loving, supportive Christian summer camp environment. Camp David specifically works to bring that opportunity to them. And so I asked my boys, they're both of age, they could come to base camp. I talked to Jaros that they could maybe come. I said, do you want to come to base camp and hear great speakers and apologetics and be trained in your Christian faith, or do you want to go to Camp David and serve? Guess what they said? I want to go to Camp David and serve. So I'd love to have them here this week, but I'm thrilled to death that they are bringing the love and human care of Christ to people at a camp a couple hours south of us here. And so we've got about 10 minutes left. I've given you a lot to digest from the history of the church, but here's where it comes down to. What will you do in your lifetime not to be served, but to serve and to provide for the needs of those around you? And remember, as we're talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, I said we'd come back to this idea of the neighbor. So here's my question for you. Who is your neighbor? Jesus questioned, which of these three was a neighbor to the man in need? Well, the one who showed him help. Now you go and do likewise. So I've laid out some ideas from the history of the church. This is how the church has not only worked but thrived in times of social upheaval. We're in times of social upheaval. How does the church seek not to be served, not have power, claim power, grab power, but to serve and give? How does the church serve? And for you, who is your neighbor that Christ calls you to go and do likewise? Now, we've got about 10 minutes, and I know what I'm supposed to do here is be open for questions. We can do that a little bit, but what I want to do more is, rather than ask questions, I want you to brainstorm and give suggestions. So think through. What do you know of your congregation doing? Or what do you think your congregation could do that they're not? What do you see, or where do you have a passion that you can be the people that St. Dionysius of Alexandria described, who went and found the people who were sick and brought them in and cared for them? How can you do as Gregory did and take the resources that God has given you, recognizing that God has not given resources to you for you, He's given resources to you for those around you? So if you have a burning question, you certainly can ask. I'm not going to shut down questions, but what I would prefer, if possible, is rather than questions, let's have brainstorming. Raise hands, talk. What does your church do that you can be involved in, or what doesn't your church do that your church should do that you can lead into the future to recognize who our neighbors are and how we can serve? Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could give me the information to where the church that's helping food out in Minnesota, so I can ask, so I can talk to my friends.
Yeah, I'll go back to the slide. I don't have the address, but it is Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And basically what I did, the newspaper article just mentioned, food available at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, Minneapolis. So I just did a Google search on Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. It was very unofficial. And it pulled this up, and so if you just do a Google search on Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, Minneapolis, maybe like food pantry, things like that, you should be able to find the address if your church wants to perhaps send a donation to help and things like that. That would be great. Other questions or brainstorming ideas? I talked really, really fast to leave time for input, so please, I could have slowed down and breathed during the presentation. So what are some ideas? What are some dreams? Do Do any of you have ambitions that you would like to, maybe perhaps you want to go into study architecture, but perhaps instead of trying to build $600,000, $700,000 homes in wealthy suburbs, you decide that instead of doing that as an architect, you would like to instead work with an urban renewal organization in the inner city to redesign houses for supporting families and building communities in downtrodden areas. Just off the top of my head, what are some ideas that you have of ways that you can lead the church? Because that's what we're calling you to do. This is not exclusively just a fun week to get together and pal around with friends and listen to engaging, thrilling speakers, but to raise you up as leaders of the church. So where and how can you serve now? Or if your church isn't offering now, lead your church in coming years to do as Christ called us to do, to love our neighbor, as we see Paul doing with collecting offerings for the church in Jerusalem, as we see in St. Dionysius of Alexandria, as we see in Gregory the Great. What are your dreams? What are your hopes? Are you just twitching, or do you have raising your hand there? Just twitching right now. Yes?
There was this movie was about real thing that's happening now. I think someplace, I think it was north or south St. Louis, not sure, but it's like now an urban area. There's a movie about what people remember how they used to live there, their childhood and stuff, but then it like got trashed and stuff, so they couldn't live there. And after I watched that movie, what I want to do, kind of, but I'm not have enough money and not well enough right now, is to buy a bunch of those, get those people together, ask them how did it look like when you were there, fix up and either film to them or
And so, like Dr. Yancey was talking about this morning, what I'm hearing from you is to, in part, facilitate the conversation. Listen. What was this community like maybe 50 years ago, 70 years ago, when it was a healthy, thriving community? Tell me about your community. Tell me about what worked there. Serve as that listening post that then we can learn and say, well then, if we're going to reshape this community in the future, how can we regain that spirit of the community and that spirit of healthy families and institutions to support that in the future, and then perhaps try to facilitate some of this urban renewal. But what I heard a lot of you, what you're saying was serve as that listening post. Gather people together that remember, what was this community like when it worked? And say, what do we need to do to regain that? So serve as a listening ear and an organization factor for renewing that spirit. Great. Other thoughts and ideas? Got about 2 minutes. Well, thoughts don't necessarily pop up instantaneously, but what I hope that what we've done today is plant a seed and see that throughout times of social upheaval through the past, the church has given sacrificially. It hasn't been easy. You realize the essence of sacrifice is that you give something up. You give up something that's valuable and precious to you. So I gave the example off the top of my head of perhaps an architect that instead of designing $700,000 homes in a wealthy subdivision works for urban renewal. Guess where that architect could make a lot of money? Designing the $700,000 houses in a wealthy suburb. He could have a really, really comfortable existence, or she. But what if she says instead, I'm going to work for an urban renewal group and design housing to foster communities, not segregation, but communities in the inner city? Guess what? They might make half, a third of what they could otherwise. That's a sacrifice. That's a real sacrifice. But Jesus calls us not to be served, but to serve. And the Christian life is one of sacrifice and giving. Sacrifice means we're giving more than what we're getting. And that's what we're called to do. So I realize those ideas don't necessarily generate spontaneously right now in the 30 seconds that I give you that's left. But think about that. And pray about that. As you consider college choices, as you consider career options, As you consider how you serve and live in your congregations throughout your life, think about this. You will continue to live through difficult times. There will continue to be places around you that are severely hurting. What does Jesus call us to do? What has the early church done? What are you called to do where God places you? So don't necessarily have to come up with answers right now, but think about that. Ponder that. Pray about that for years. Where does God place you to give and to serve? Who is your neighbor who is in need? And as Jesus pointed to the Good Samaritan in his parable, recognize your neighbor, and now you go and do likewise. Thank you.